Which historical tragedy were you weirdly obsessed with as a child? Vitamin Samwonki said, The Titanic. Tom TC73 said, The Mary Celeste story always creeped me out. It was an American merchant ship in 1861 that went missing. That was pretty common in those times, so it wasn't a big deal, but later, IDK the time frame, it was found adrift with all the crew missing, but there was not even a hint of any disturbances, and food was actually found on the table ready to be served, so it looked as if the crew just all vanished one day mid-sailing. There was also no valuables took, so it was clear that nobody invaded it. IDK just always found it weird. 2 Cent Sam said, I wrote a paper on this. If you don't want your bubble burst, stop reading now. There's a couple things to take note of. 1. The lifeboat was missing and a tattered rope was dragging behind the abandoned ship. 2. The cargo that was being carried is a critical consideration. So what happened? The ship was carrying lots of barrels of some specific alcohol. Some of the barrels were standard, reliable wooden barrels. However, some were made of a much more porous type of wood, many of which were found to be empty or near empty. So what happened is that the porous barrels were leaking fumes, or the alcohol was soaking through the wood and vaporizing, evaporating. Not sure on the word here. It probably didn't give off much of an odor, but those fumes are extremely dangerous in the hull of a ship like that. This was not unheard of at the time. So one day the gases reach dangerous levels, something causes a spark, possibly a door latch smacking into something too hard, and the fumes ignite. There's somewhat of an explosion, but no real damage is done. It's just a quick flash fire. The crew realizes what's happening and fears another explosion. So they jump in the lifeboat, tie with a rope hanging off the stern of the ship, and they all get in. Their goal is to wait it out for a while. Unfortunately, a storm comes up and the rope snaps. The crew drifts away in the lifeboat or it sinks, and the Mary Celeste continues on, left as it was the moment the crew jumped into a lifeboat. Zarakeen said, Titanic for me as well. I'd say it was the start of the weirdly obsessed historical tragedies that I have even to today. I remember the National Geographic about it and even had a model Titanic ship that I'd pretend to sink in the bathtub. The movie ruined it for me for a number of years as it for teenage me associated Titanic as a girly film, but now that I'm older and don't care, I've been back into watching stuff again about the Titanic. Historic Travels on YouTube has a lot of good videos about it and other shipwrecks. Negative Snow 1346 said, The plague, any plague really, they were quite common, but in this case the Black Death. It gave me a reverence and interest for disease in general, and it showed how powerless humans are against something so minuscule and seemingly invisible. No one knew how to protect themselves or how diseases spread, so they came up with all sorts of theories and cures. If you were a normal person back then in a highly religious Europe, you would think the end times were surely near. The atmosphere among the general population must have been really bleak. Also, those plague doctor uniforms just look really cool. Panchoraborn said, It's not a specific event, but I was flat obsessed with the Bermuda Triangle as an elementary school kid. I read more than 50 books on it. I was scared to death of it. I was convinced that all airplanes and boats were in serious danger if they went through it. I assumed they all actively went around it every day. I couldn't figure out why it was happening, but it must be serious. As someone who lives in Florida and travels by both plane and boat through it, pre-COVID, a few times a year, this life is not one I expected. It was way more important to preteen me than it really is, which is not at all. Dreamwolf 321 said, I'm going to simplify it, so if there's an inaccuracy, forgive me. The Romanovs were in charge of Russia during World War I. Anastasia's father, Nicholas I wasn't the best ruler. He probably would have been happier as a military officer or farmer, but he was in charge of Russia. And he was a crappy one. Russia's lower class were suffering severely and didn't want to join World War I, but Nicholas sided with the Allied powers. Many Russians died in an unpopular war to them. They turned on Nicholas and his family and revolted. Eventually, the party against Nicholas overthrew the government and arrested the family. They were kept under basically house arrest for a while. The family thought eventually they would be rescued, so the daughters sewed diamonds they brought with them into their clothes for safekeeping, in order to have income when they were freed. Rescue never came. One night, the entire family plus their servants with them and their pets were led into the basement on their location for a family portrait. They were then told they would be executed and the firing squad started shooting, starting with Nicholas. Dreamwolf 321 said. However, because guns produce smoke, they could only fire a couple of rounds before the smoke was impossible to see through, so the squad left the room. Many survived the initial firing with only minor injuries. Apart from Nicholas and maybe his wife, the squad came back in and fired again. Problem is, the girls sewed diamonds in their clothes, so the bullets were ricocheted off of them. The squad left again, with the girls, I believe the only survivors at this point, crying and suffering from their injuries and trauma. The squad came back in again, and made sure they executed them the third time. Don't 100% remember how they killed them, may have varied. Bayonets may have been involved, one was shot in the head I think. I also remember hearing bludgeoned to death, but I don't know for sure. They were buried in secret, as all of this was done by the rival party, not an official government execution. They also buried the son and one of the daughters separately in case anyone found the bodies. The only survivor was the son's Cocker Spaniel, Joy. Sorry again if I reported something inaccurately. The Monarchist 18 said. The massacre of the Romanov family occurred on the night of 16th July 17, 1918. Tsar Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, all of their children, including Anastasia, alongside a few of their servants were brutally bayoneted and shot to death by several Bolshevik revolutionaries in Ekaterinburg. The family's remains have only been officially exhumed in 1991, and sadly, there have been many people who have impersonated the children of the family, claiming to have survived the execution, most notably Anna Anderson. All members of the family, however, are currently recognized as passion bearers in Orthodox Christianity. A church has been built over the site of the brutal massacre. Numerous Radio 7229 said. TBH, when I went in 2019, the new safe containment kind of disappointed me. Of course it is necessary, but I always wanted to see it with the original sarcophagus in the iconic cooling tower of reactor number 4. It looked so iconically ominous and emblematic of the entire disaster, whereas the new safe containment looks like a soccer stadium. Regardless, it had to be done lol. It was also really neat when I was flying into Ukraine from Latvia. We were blessed with exceptionally clear skies and the flight was low altitude, so I could see everything on the ground from the plane window. We actually flew directly over Chernobyl, so I got to see the new safe containment from the sky. It is huge, before seeing it up close, which was neat. Belly Goat said. I am still utterly fascinated by Chernobyl. Everything about it, the history, the actual disaster, the science that I barely understand, the effects of radiation to the human body, the helplessness after the fact, gods it's just awesome, as an inspiring awe, not the Mizausum. Seeing the HBO miniseries when it came out brought me to tears. And yet I'm still a huge fan of nuclear energy. McCohy said. That's an interesting bit of history though, that you were a descendant of one of the victims. Very sad though. No connection here, but I was also pretty obsessed with the Salem witch trials for some reason. I read so many books, both fictional and factual, about it and watched so many movies. There was also some kind of interactive flash game I used to play that cast you as one of the victims. I was a bit obsessed. Professor Rootbeer said. I was, well, still am, to be honest, obsessed with dirigibles as a kid. I remember getting salty in middle school history class because the Hindenburg wasn't even the worst airship crash, just the most publicized. I campaigned for the creation of the new passenger airship line for a project in 8th grade. Unfortunately, due to Hindenburg-related bad press, the idea was not exactly well received by my class, and between helium shortages and sheer cost inefficiency these days, it seems unlikely that could ever come to fruition. Formal Mango said. The U.S. Civil War. My great-aunt gave me a copy of a book called The Yankee Saddle, by Vernon Howard, to read when I was a kid. She's been given it by her Sunday school teacher when she was young. It's a Christian youth book. I think she wanted me to pay more attention to the Christian message in the book, but instead I read it, and was pretty much instantly obsessed with all things Civil War. Movies, books, music, poetry. Then my dad gave me a copy of Battle Cry of Freedom, the Civil War era by James M. McPherson for my birthday when I turned 12, and I devoured it. When I was 14, we moved to America for a year or so, and Ed and one of his co-workers took me on a Civil War historical battlefield tour, and it was like my Disneyland. The Half-Truth said. It's not a piece of history. The U.S. is still actively attempting to eradicate the Native American way of life by forcing them to integrate into modern American society. They intentionally create extreme poverty on the Native American reservations, then offer them ways to escape that poverty that all involve leaving their tribe and reservation and integrating into modern society. The U.S. then seizes land granted to the natives by treaty in order to build oil pipelines or start mining operations, and sends in the National Guard and other security forces to brutalize the natives when they resist the seizure of their land. I drink anarchy said. The Lake Nyas disaster. Without warning, and for reasons not exactly known, a lake in Cameroon basically exploded with CO2 in the middle of the night in 1985. It killed almost 2,000 people by asphyxiating them in their sleep, not to mention the incredible amount of livestock and animal life that also died. Essentially, a cloud of carbon dioxide, and possibly some other gases, spewed out of the lake and kept close to the ground, and just wiped a few villages. It blew my mind that a lake could hold gas like that, and then also release it. I first read about it in National Geographic, and I must have read that article 100 times. I've watched many a documentary on it. It still somewhat fascinates me in a morbid sort of way. It's a very unique kind of natural disaster, and not many of its kind have been witnessed. What Avero said. I think it was the Joy Luck Club book I read in 7th grade where the author's mother was recounting her experience with China's Cultural Revolution. It just seemed so surreal and impossible that it actually happened. The idea that a regular society could just be taken over and destroyed by a raging mob of dogmatic idiots was terrifying. It seemed impossible, like how could the sane just be overridden? Cut to today, Trump, the mask bullshit, denying people's rights in Jesus' name. Didn't think I'd see it illustrated in my lifetime and in the US. Spirited Warning 8203 said. Frank Slide, mainly because it's close and even when I was young. When you drive through the pass there is a certain feeling that's ominous. The sheer size of the boulders on the sides of the highway never ceased to amaze me. Was just through there yesterday and I still stare. I also get very pissy when there are people climbing on the rocks. It's like they have no regard for final resting places. Binaire Royalty said. The Holocaust. I've always been curious about the psychology of basically everything. I was really confused as to why the Nazis believed what they did. And since I couldn't see why with my own logic, I guess I felt like I had to read every bit of info I could. I still don't empathize with why they did it obviously, but with more real-world experience I know most of the people were either power-hungry or cowardly. Seems to be the only explanation why. Calarang said. The Titanic, as I've seen others say. I remember watching A Night to Remember as a little kid and for some reason, I was just oddly fascinated by it. I even had Polar the Titanic bear my dad found for me at a flea market. I was of course, obsessed with the Titanic movie. It's still kind of a thing that stuck throughout the years. Several years ago at Barnes & Noble I picked up Titanic Remembered 1912 to 2012. It was a large book full of info. It also came with blueprints, replicas of tickets, etc. The other one that comes to mind is Jack the Ripper. I did my senior paper on it. I don't even remember how it qualified, but we were allowed to choose any topic. Elenathan said. There was a series of popular children's books in my country that dealt with childhood friendships during a historical time of war. It was mostly World War II, but my favorite one was one that dealt with the military dictatorship in my country, from 1967 to 1974. They tortured, exiled and killed a lot of people. The book had a graphic description of the protagonist's godfather, that was imprisoned and tortured for his liberal views. It kinda scarred me and made me know a lot more. I was 10 or so. Malcolm X Freeman said. The Maroling incident, a suicide pact with Prince Rudolph and his mistress at the Royal Hunting Lodge in Maroling. World War I, just the rapid advancement of several technologies and tactics. Artillery becoming an indirect fire weapon and requiring a spotter. Machine guns changing advancement tactics, plastic surgery for wounded soldiers, aerial combat, the Italian Arditi, the first modern shock troopers. Suck My Lobster said. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing. I once watched a documentary about that event and it haunts me ever since. How people could go poof turned to dust just like that because of how powerful the explosion was. People got their skin burned alive and hanging off their bodies, and the effects of the radiation even years later. My heart always aches for the victims. Sky Administrative 970 said, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Started in grade 5 when I found a book on 2 girls who survived Hiroshima. I don't remember much from the book except the firebomb hoods the girls carried to school with them. Thick canvas covered in leather to make it less likely the embers from the American firebombings would catch the girls' hair on fire. While firebombings were cool, the nukes were what stole my interest. So much destructive power kept in such small a package. The devastation of Ground Zero. The shadows left on the concrete from the people vaporized. I got obsessed with nuclear theory and nuclear weapons history. Still am. I've learned to not share my obsession openly, but if people want to talk about the craziness of mad American nuclear doctrine, I got all night. During the early years things were super ad hoc. After the war the US didn't have a formal production line or chain of command or deployment doctrine. There was the Los Alamos lab and test range. In such alpha stages of production, when inspectors came around they found half-assembled nukes hastily tarped and left in the mud while it rained. Meanwhile every branch of the military wants their own big bombs to play with. Including but not limited to. The Army wanted a nuclear landmine for tanks. Sky Administrative 970 said. The Air Force wanted nuclear surface-to-airs and air-to-air rockets for dogfights and interception. The Navy wanted nuclear torpedoes for deleting battleships. The Marines wanted to use small tactical nukes for denial of area. Mainly cutting impassable borders between supply lines. Think the divide from Fallout New Vegas Lonesome Road. Meanwhile the actual ownership of the nukes and their materials was the Department of Energy. This is because of a bunch of bureaucracy about nuclear power plants and hiding the production process of weapons. All this mixed with a healthy amount of human error and ignorance. For several years the launch code for all American nukes was 00000000. While formally there was supposed to be an uncrackable code. Base commanders did not want such a technicality to impede an attack, hence the default zeros. Incidents of lost nukes, misplaced nukes. One Joe Bob borrowing what he thought was a training nuke to show his girlfriend. Even showed a guy at the base gated under a tarp in his pickup. The training nukes and real nukes were stored next to each other in the same storage lockup. Guess what mistake this dude made? Sky Administrative 970 said. Joyride's gone wrong. Too many fires to count. All the while under-reporting or no reporting on so much of it. If you're like me and want to know a crack load about America and its nuclear program, go on Audible and find the book. Command and Control, The Damascus Incident. Seriously, it's worth the money for the eye-opening read it is. Gooey Boba 14 said. So many. So freaking many. The Holocaust and the Titanic, 11-14 years old. I still love the trilogy I read about the Titanic. 11-year-old me was obsessed. I also started reading Ken Follett's New Century trilogy. In hindsight they were quite heavy for my age, and I was learning about the Holocaust at school. Henry VIII and his wives, 13 years old. Oh, the days of Six the musical. Brings back memories. Chernobyl, 7 years old. Nuclear shit exploded. Tragedy strikes. The details are crazy and freaky. I would feel sad for the victims and I was disturbed the more I read about it. Lobotomies. My poor grandmother never heard the end of letting me read that psychology book at 9 years old. Gooey Boba 14 said. TBF, I still love psychology now. I was dealing with some shit at that age and being able to understand that the reason I was feeling the way I did was due to brain chemistry sort of helped me cope. It was fascinating and gruesome and I was obsessed with imagining humans as complex machines. Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, 4 to 8 years old. I remember making short biographies that were just copies of the books I would read for the last one because my mom wanted me to learn American history, and I for some reason just honed in on Abraham Lincoln. LOL. I suppose because in my 4-year-old brain, it was the most straightforward, slavery bad point in American history. Keep It Kid 2017 said. When the UK exited the exchange rate mechanism in 1992 on an event called Black Wednesday, I could not understand how the get let it get so far. At the time I worked on FX trading floors. In fact I was on a customer's trading floor that day, Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt. Nobody understood it really what happened, until a few days later when I was told that Chancellor was an idiot and John Major out of his depth. I did not believe that, refused to admit to myself that you will be so callous at your job. Years later I saw a documentary, and Kenneth Clark, who was the Home Secretary at the time, explained that he was in somebody's office. And they asked if anybody had a radio so they can follow what the news is regarding the event. The tragedy of British politics is fascinating. Lucia Usofborg said, "The rise of the Third Reich in Nazi Germany. I remember being in 7th grade, reading this 500-page book about Hitler. I was so obsessed and intrigued by the whole period. I remember watching Schindler's List in the theater and getting the VHS to watch it on loop. I especially loved Ralph Fiennes' representation of the Nazi war criminal Amon Goeth. I don't think it truly clicked with me how heinous their acts and crimes against humanity was at that age. I remember my sister, who was 6 years older than me, asked how I would feel if some officers came to our house, separated us from our parents and sent us to concentration camps because we are Mexican. I think that's when it clicked." Dumais Hijabi said, "The Holocaust. I had read the Diary of Anne Frank when I was 12 and felt numb with shock when I reached the last page, where they detailed what happened to her after the annex was discovered. Cue an intense Wikipedia study session followed by books and movies and whatnot. The massive and senseless loss of life and innocence for mere ideology made me question everything taught to me and the stereotypes I had grown up with. Still cannot go through 12th of June every year without sparing some thought to the massive suffering and sheer destruction it brought about." Thubig Broke said, "Not me but my little brother was 11 when he was absolutely fascinated by 9/11 and the conspiracies surrounding it for the longest time. I have no clue why or how. He'd just tell me random facts and conspiracy theories about 9/11 almost daily. He'd watch documentaries on his phone about it all the time. Then one day he just suddenly stopped being interested in 9/11 and hasn't talked about it since. He calls it his 9/11 phase, and I always thought that was the strangest thing to be interested in." Saw 3154 said, "Not me, but my school did a grade-wide presentation on the Civil War where each group got a new topic, for example propaganda during the war, and while working the teacher brings an example board on the Holocaust in to show us what to do. Later some kids enter the library where we work. One of them about 6 years old was staring intently at the Holocaust board. During the presentation the kid walks up and asked where's the Holocaust, and we all started laughing. To this day Holocaust kid is an inside joke with my friends." Mitchell06 said, "JFK assassination. I was in a talented and gifted class where we would meet about 30 minutes a day and do basically nothing. My teacher for that class had old-time magazines with very graphic photos of the event. I asked to see them all the time and would and over them. I am pretty embarrassed about it because 1. I probably freaked her out and 2. I wasn't at an age where I understood death and tragedy, so I really lacked empathy, which is the complete opposite of who I am today. I was so sheltered that the idea of someone's head getting blown off was cool to me, not proud of this." Newish and Nutjob said, "I wouldn't say I was obsessed with it, but I've always found World War I to be fascinating, even as a teenager. The trenches, U-boats, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the crazy domino effect that set it off 19th century tactics versus, then, modern weaponry and technology, cavalry versus machine guns, the first use of chemical warfare, how it basically caused the collapse of empires and kingdoms into nation-states, how America almost stayed neutral until Germany tried to get Mexico to attack them, how it spanned the globe, and came to an end after only 4 years, how many people died in those 4 years, and how it set up World War II barely 2 decades later. It's such a crazy bit of world history." Merricade11 said, "I don't remember any that I was obsessed with when I was very young. I just had a general interest in natural disasters when I was in the 1st grade. However, when I was a young teenager, I became borderline obsessed with the Donner Party because of a band I liked. I loved to research about the different people involved in their eventual fates. I specifically remember, after an APS history class when the Donner Party was mentioned, I asked my teacher to check out the band I liked. I still don't know if he ever did." Saltice Thorst said, "The Titanic. Like I was so obsessed. Every time I went to the school library, I would almost always check out a book about that and another book. I would doodle it everywhere possible. My desk, sheets of schoolwork paper, my folders, even my literal tablet case. I would watch videos about it on a daily basis. Infographic show, Bright Side, Lindsay Holiday, you fucking name it. I even wanted to write a historical fiction book about it. Heck, I even made characters and everything for it. I would download every ebook that had to do with it on my Amazon free time. Like you literally wouldn't even know. It ended up getting to the point where my mom wouldn't let me do anything that had to do with it. Even my oldest sister got involved. But did that stop me? Hell no. Even though I've gotten over it a while ago, I still think I needed some help. I blame my second grade teacher. She was the one that got me interested in the first place.